start that off, I'm going to introduce Pauline, who's then going to introduce Dr. Mcpherson to give us the wide scope of how we got here and how he sees it now. Pauline has been around and following and helping Guy do videos and books and websites and just everything. She's been his right hand persona for many years. And so put your hands together for Pauline Snyder, co-author of some books.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. You guys are amazing. And I really want to thank this gentleman here who worked so hard for this tour to happen. Thank you for your speech. It's been a wild ride. We've been driving for 7 hours. We've got 11 more hours to drive. And that was after Alaska. But I think we're moving. I had to write everything down. I usually hide behind the camera because it's a lot safer there. But I met Guy in 2013. He came to my town, spoke in my library, rocked my world. I went to bed for a few weeks and cried. And then I said, okay, what am I going to do? Because I was a transition town person. I was growing food. I was growing all kinds of things, teaching people how to grow food, how to eat chickens, how to reskill. And I'm like, okay, what do I do that I can do more than that? And so I followed this gentleman around for a year, and I did a short documentary. And you can see it. It's based on his book, Going Dark. It's on Vimeo and YouTube. But that's sort of what I did to get out of my stuck mode. And it helped. It did what I loved. It was doing photography, making a film. But here's the thing, we've got so many more things to do. We were in Hayward, we were in Monterey, we were in Santa Cruz, we're going to Colfax tomorrow, then back to Berkeley and Chico, and then finally in Ashland, the old stomping grounds of this gentleman here. And then we part ways, and then Guy and I will head to Portland, Oregon. The journey is not over yet, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming tonight, and thank those folks who donated on Eventbrite. It's the first time we've ever used that. I know it's been sketchy, it had some kind of glitches, but I'm not sure, so thank you for tolerating that and making it work. I want to thank all the people who've been hosting us and feeding us and driving us. And Vicki is keeping us, we're staying in her bed, and thank you so much.
It's been great.
You are amazing. And Ginny B next to her, who's been wonderful, getting interviews that never pan out, but that's all right. One of the things is we don't have Penguin Publisher or New York Times in our back pocket. So this is all thanks to you that we can make this trip. It's just me, my little Wood Thrush Productions company, and I have really only one client, a Dr. Guy Mcpherson. You may have heard of him. So through that little company, I do the videos and published our books. And this is probably going to be the first time in years that Guy will actually get paid for his books. He's not gotten a dime from any of the previous publishers, and those were not Amazon publishers. So we're really, we'll be able to pay for the gas, so to speak. What else?
You want to mention the books real quick while you're there? Ones that are available
Sure.
tonight?
Yeah, the bookshop. We have some books here. We have books right here. We have a hardback book for $30, and you get it signed. And we also have paperback for $15, and you can also get that signed. And these are, we made these books. Nobody else did. This is our creation, so we're very proud of it. I'm going to let Guy describe the picture. It goes into the rule. I'll let him talk about that.
And the honeybee.
And the honeybee. Well, we don't have very many honeybee books.
We got a couple.
A few years ago, about 4 years ago, Guy and I wrote a book called Ms. Ladybug and Mr. Honeybee, a love story at the end of time. I don't know if anybody here knows that book. But it was a fiction. a work of fiction. I did the artwork, and it's a young person's book, sort of written in the vein of Charlotte's Web, Watership Down, that sort of thing. It was really fun to do. So it's available. We have a couple copies here, but it's available through Amazon as well. I am not sure what else I need to tell you, but you know, one of the things is a lot of you are here because you're looking for the truth. You're looking for somebody who's not going to sugarcoat it, at least not too badly. We already know we're in trouble. We know that we've been lied to. A lot of us have been in trenches for years. You know, I was a tar sands pipeline arrestee. I was out there with Bill McKibben. You know, and we're so frustrated at this point. We don't know what else to do. Tie ourselves to trees. People have hung themselves up in trees for years, and it's still happening. People are still destroying the planet. It doesn't seem like anything is going to really make a difference. We've marched, we've written letters, we've cried, we've written books, we've made movies. I mean, how much more can we do before something changes? And what if something doesn't change? What if nothing ever changes? And what if the only thing we can change is ourselves, within ourselves, with each other? And that might be the only thing that we can change. And look at this special room that we're in right now. It's sort of like a hint. It's like, hint! Look within! But maybe it's something, maybe there is something we can do. But it might not be digging more trenches or more marches or letters. It doesn't pay. It doesn't pay financially, but it pays in. And I'd like to introduce you to one of my heroes. Actually, probably the greatest hero. Professor Emeritus of Conservation Biology at the University of Arizona, Professor Guy Mcpherson. I'll go like this and the other dance.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Pauline, who's behind the camera. Thanks to Peter for organizing the vast majority of this trip on the West Coast, all the way from San Jose, where we landed a week or so ago, up to Ashland, finishing in Portland, as Pauline said, starting in Alaska, where a graduate student used her frequent flyer miles to get us there, and arranged a couple of venues on the University of Alaska campus. I want to talk about something I know almost nothing about. Peter indicated that you could leave at any time and there would be no shame whatsoever. I really blame Peter because everybody pointed to him when they asked why they're here.
Yeah.
So Peter apparently is shouldering a large burden here. If you want to leave, we can blame Peter for that too. I want to talk about planetary hospice. And I don't know anything about planetary hospice. I've never experienced hospice as a, dying person, or from the perspective of a friend or family member who's dying. And yet, I think that's the step forward that we must take at this time. We are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. We're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction on Earth. There's no question about either of these statements. So how do we act? How do we behave? I want to start with a quote from Stephen Jenkinson. Stephen Jenkinson has, for the last 40 years, essentially all of his adult life, been working what he calls the death trade. The death trade. And as a consequence, he's always part of a team, including a medical doctor and a nurse and maybe some other people. And every week, the team meets to discuss the person who's been diagnosed with a terminal condition. So this person has been diagnosed, they have days, weeks, months to live. And every single meeting, the question comes up, when do we sedate? When do we sedate? And Stephen Jenkinson, for hundreds, thousands of these meetings now, says we begin sedation right now. The friends and the family really need sedated. The patient knows. The patient knows they are going to die and they accept it. It's the people in the patient's lives who don't accept it. Stephen Jenkinson writes, the great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They're two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. Taking a page from the Grief Recovery Handbook and the Grief Recovery Institute, I would suggest that grief recovery is the way to proceed. After we experience the grief, on behalf of ourselves, on behalf of our families and friends, on behalf of the living planet. Hope is wishful thinking. Here's the dictionary definition, straight from the Merriam-Webster online dictionary. To want something to happen or be true. To want something to happen or be true. Hope is wishful thinking. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to accept things the way they are. Moving on to grief, I love the Grief Recovery Institute's definition of grief, which is wishing for a different past. Until I got that definition, a little more than 5 years ago, I didn't understand that what I was experiencing was grief. Because that's one of the things we don't talk about in this culture. We don't allow ourselves to have the conversation about grief or grieving or death or dying or bodily functions or sex. In other words, all the important things and the things we do most often are the things we never talk about. The Grief Recovery Institute defines grief as wishing for a different past. Wishing for a different past. The reason that we grieve, let's take the example of a death. The reason we grieve the death of someone we loved is because we did not complete that relationship. We did not say, I love you, that last time. We did not say, I'm sorry. We did not seek forgiveness from that person. The relationship is incomplete. So we are wishing that we had done that. Had we done that, had we spent the time with the person who was dying in their last 2 weeks or 2 months, and had the conversations that only dying people are willing to have about the full truth concerning their lives, only then can we consider that relationship complete. And then we don't grieve anymore. We don't grieve for that past that would have been. Oh, I wish I had said something to that somebody. We're all familiar with the Janet Reno expression, if you see something, say something. But I wonder, if you see abrupt irreversible climate change, if you see the sixth mass extinction, do you say something? I suspect most people here have had relationships turn south because they said something. I certainly have. So you might want to take that anecdote that you perhaps have experienced as a lesson. You don't have to talk about everything with everybody in your life. Your friends around the water cooler at the workplace that you consider your friends. You probably never talk about your sex life at home with those people. Maybe you don't want to talk about the sixth mass extinction with those people. Maybe you can have a perfectly reasonable relationship in which you don't talk about everything. And that brings me to a point here. If you don't want to hear that there's an asteroid about to strike Earth and therefore cause the loss of habitat for humans and most other species on the planet, then it might be time to leave. And there will certainly be no shame. I can hardly stand to hear myself talk already. And if you want to leave, you can just whisper Peter's name on the way out. He dragged you into this, so seriously, if at any time you want to leave, please do. I was expecting a screen to help lead you through some of this, obviously, and so I'm just using the file as my notes now. I need to point out that this has happened before. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction on Earth within the last 500 million years. This particular extinction event most closely resembles the Permian event, which is the 3rd mass extinction event. And it was characterized by loss of more than 90% of the species on Earth. This particular extinction event is proceeding at approximately 10 times the rate of the Great Dying 252 million years ago. Perhaps because we're pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere about 10 times faster than occurred during the Permian extinction event. So of course, we're losing species at a rapid rate because we're despoiling the planet. So that shouldn't come as a particular surprise if anybody's been paying attention to any news at all. There's been 15 or 20 years, scientists have been writing books for the public, for the lay public, about the 6th mass extinction. So we've known about this for at least 15 years, probably closer to 2 decades. And yet, the 6th mass extinction was not noted in the peer-reviewed literature until 2015. For the first time, in a paper by Gerardo Ceballos and colleagues in Science Advances in June of 2015, the peer-reviewed literature, which is stunningly conservative, admits that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. And then in 2017, Ceballos and other colleagues, not complete overlap with the co-authors, announced a paper that was in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States in July of 2017, and the paper begins biological annihilation via the ongoing 6th mass extinction. So we were into it at that point. We still are. Nothing has slowed down since 2017. I wanted to point out how conservative the peer-reviewed literature is, and typically how far behind the publishing of books the peer-reviewed literature is. Paul Ehrlich, who probably most of you know for his work on the book The Population Bomb from 1968, for his work at Stanford University over 50 years now. His comment when interviewed about that second paper, when we were in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, he was a co-author on that paper, and he said in an interview, we're toxifying the entire planet. We're toxifying the entire planet. There are 2 means by which a species can go functionally extinct, and I want to talk about functional extinction here. Functional extinction occurs from one of 2 means. The inability to reproduce. Conservation biologists talk about the minimum viable population size, MVP, which you might know as most valuable player. In this case, that doesn't apply. It's the minimum viable population size. When
the population drops down to a certain level, there's not enough genetic material remaining for the species to persist into the future. A classic example is the 2 remaining white rhinos on a nature preserve in Kenya. They're both female. Well, it's pretty clear to see that's not going to work out. The species is functionally extinct. There's no bringing it back. The other means of functional extinction is loss of habitat. Habitat is the environment in which a species typically lives and grows. That's the simple definition. I've taught courses that required 45 hours in the classroom just talking about habitat, but that'll do for now. For example, Homo sapiens does not typically live and grow in cities. For the first at least 300,000 years of the species Homo sapiens, we did not live and grow in cities. Now we do. Cities are the very definition of civilization. They require us to grow, store, and distribute grains at scale, which is how we define any civilization. Or as Daniel Quinn describes it in his book Ishmael and several books that followed, civilization is the ability to lock up the food. Once you're growing grains at scale, you're able to lock up the food and determine who gets which, who gets what amount. There's nothing particularly nefarious about it, except by the time we get to large populations, invariably some individuals try to control that population. And what better way than locking up the food? So we have...
Speaking of controlling things, one moment, sir.
So we have two means of achieving functional extinction. I'm not going to talk about when the last individual on Earth is going to die. I'm not going to talk about extinction per se. Instead, I'm going to point to a variety of means by which we lose habitat for our species. Clearly, we're nowhere close to total reproductive failure. With 7.7 billion people and growing by more than 200,000 every day, we don't need to worry about having enough genetic material around. We do need to worry about loss of habitat for our species. In fact, there's a paper that just came out about a week ago from Europe. It was published by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. It does not include a date on it, so I can't give you a date, but it just came out within the last 2 weeks, so it's very recent. And here's a quote from the extensive synthetic paper. An increase of 1.5 degrees, and that's 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline that marks the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. An increase of 1.5 degrees is the maximum the planet can tolerate. At worst, the extinction of humankind altogether will result. 1.5 degrees above the 1750 baseline. Apparently, the authors of that synthetic work have not kept up with the referee journal literature, indicating that we're at least 1 3/4 degrees above the 1750 baseline. So it could very well be that 1.5 degrees does the trick. And that's what the latest IPCC report from October of 2018 concludes, is that there's a huge difference between 1.5 and 2. We give Nobel Prizes to people who say 2 is fine. But 1.5 is the absolute upper limit that we should not cross. And in fact, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases in October of 1990 said 1 was the absolute upper limit. Then David Spratt in October of 2014, climate science writer and speaker, says we triggered self-reinforcing feedback loops in abundance somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 degree above that 1750 baseline, and none of us were alive when we were 1/4 degree above the 1750 baseline. And yet we triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops, those so-called positive feedbacks, at that time. According to a paper by James Hansen and colleagues in 2017 in Earth System Dynamics, that 1 3/4 degrees above the 1750 baseline that we were experiencing in 2017 is the highest temperature with humans on the planet, with Homo sapiens on Earth. I've thought of 7 different ways that we could lose habitat for Homo sapiens. And rather than go through all of them, I'm going to mention only 2. One of them should be obvious to everybody, and that's continued heating of the planet. In other words, maintenance of industrial civilization. Tim Garrett first, and other authors later. Tim Garrett is an atmospheric scientist, head of the atmospheric sciences program at the University of Utah, And he has concluded that civilization is a heat engine, and based upon the response from the peer-reviewed literature, it's hard to disagree. Industrial civilization is a heat engine that is heating the planet. And it doesn't really matter how we power this set of living arrangements. Solar panels, wind turbines, they all heat the planet. So that's one side of what my friend Bill Eddy calls the Mcpherson Paradox. How fast? Well, there's a paper in the December 26, 2018 edition of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Burke and colleagues. So this is just from a few months ago. And the title of the paper is Pliocene and Eocene Provide Best Analogs for Near Future Climate. How soon? How near future? They conclude in their paper, quote, our study suggests that climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as soon as 2030 and persist under climate stabilization scenarios. What is the Pliocene? Well, that's a time roughly 2.5 million to 5.3 million years ago in which the global average temperature of the planet was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today. So maintaining the heat engine that is industrial civilization warms the planet, according to this paper in the peer-reviewed literature, to a very high level in a very short period of time. Already, according to the peer-reviewed literature, the very slow rates of change through 2012, in a paper published 2013, the speed already outstrips the ability of vertebrates to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times. If we stabilize immediately, mammals will require several million years to recover from the current high level of heating of the planet. That's from a more recent paper published last year. So, climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as early as 2030. Given the rate of change going on right now, vertebrates can't keep up. Given the rate of change going on right now, mammals can't keep up. We're vertebrate mammals. The Pliocene type climate in as short a period of time as by 2030 is stunningly fast, and conservation biologists know that what really matters is the rate of change of the environment. That's key here, the rate of change of the environment.
So when you say the Pliocene within about 10 years, what would that look like in terms of going through day to day for a human like you and me? Would we just not exist if the Pliocene exists in 10 years?
I can't imagine any way that there would be a human on the planet with that rate of change. It's just too fast for complex organisms such as ourselves to keep up. It's not that we aren't adaptable. We're stunningly adaptable. The problem is, the greater problem is that we depend upon a whole bunch of species that are not very adaptable. So most of you have undoubtedly heard about the insect apocalypse that's going on. You never have to clean your windshield anymore. When I was a kid and we would travel around with my parents and my two siblings, we'd take these epic road trips in the summertime, and my mom was always reminding my dad not to wash the windshield because half the time we were stopping to wash the windshield, not because we needed gas. So she was reminding him to wash the headlights. Because when darkness fell, you couldn't see through the headlights because there's so many bugs on them. So insects are at the base of the terrestrial food chain, and invertebrates are at the base of the marine food web. And so if we lose those, we lose a whole bunch of things in between, right up to and undoubtedly including humans, no matter how adaptable we are, because we need pollinators, we need decomposers, we need the filtering animals that keep the water clean for us. We need all these things that other species are doing for us. So, it's hard for me to imagine a human on the planet. If there is one, I suspect he or she will be in a bunker bathing in ionizing radiation from the catastrophic meltdown of the world's 450 plus nuclear power stations, and dehydrated and hungry and surrounded by the bodies of like-minded sociopaths, which doesn't sound like a lot of fun to me. But if there's a human being alive in that far in the future, I suspect that's what it's going to look like.
Are you saying the warming is going to cause the reactors to go off?
Not the warming directly, the loss of this set of living arrangements. We depend heavily upon grains, as with every previous version of civilization. If we can no longer grow, store, and distribute grains at scale, this set of living arrangements goes away. And when it does, I doubt very many people continue to go to their job, including at the nuclear power facility.
Well, they won't regulate the power plants because they're dead, basically.
They require grid-tied power. There's a paper that came out just 2 days ago indicating that 90% of United States nuclear power plants are not prepared for climate change. Most of them are on the ocean or next to a river. The rivers are getting too hot. You need really cold water to cool the spent fuel rods, which aren't really even spent. And so there's a bunch of problems associated with maintaining nuclear power facilities. And it's one of those things that apparently we just didn't think through when we built the things. So maintaining them requires grid-tied power. Stunningly, we didn't build them so they can run off their own power and maintain themselves indefinitely. How did we not think that through? But we didn't. So, you know, even first responders stop going to the job within a few days after a major event. They go home to their families. They're not going to try to keep the planet safe for everybody else when they have families at home. And so it's difficult for me to imagine nuclear power workers going to their job when money doesn't mean much. A subsequent paper, after the Hansen and colleagues' paper in December 2011 in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics, was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research Atmospheres by Levy and colleagues on the 20th of May, 2013. You can look it up. And in that paper, they conclude as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity will cause the global average temperature to rise 1 degree Celsius. Hansen says in 5 days. Most climate scientists have concluded that the time for the particulates to fall out of the sky, the aerosols, would be closer to 6 weeks. Either way, it's the blink of a geological eye. As little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity could drive a global average temperature rise of 1 degree C. It's all about the rate of change. That's a far too rapid rate of change for humans to adapt, not to mention many other species.
Did I hear something wrong? So a reduction in industrial activity causes this thing to happen?
Yes, you heard that correctly. Whoa, now I just blew your mind, didn't I? Everybody's telling you to reduce emissions. Yeah, go figure. It's why it's called the Mcpherson Paradox by my friend Bill Eddy, because if we maintain industrial civilization, we continue to heat the planet. Everybody knows that. If we stop or even reduce industrial activity, we heat the planet even faster. How could that be? We know about greenhouse gases. We know that carbon dioxide and water vapor and methane and chlorofluorocarbons and nitrous oxide and on the list goes. There are 43 greenhouse gases. And we know what they do. The planet heats up and long-wave radiation gets trapped by those greenhouse gases, the so-called greenhouse effect, because it happens in a greenhouse. So long-wave radiation, some of it gets trapped, and the Earth continues to heat up as a result of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which are acting like the windows on your car or the windows on a greenhouse. However, Same time industrial activity produces greenhouse gases, it also produces aerosols. Mostly from burning coal, but also from burning oil and gas. Aerosols are produced, they go into the atmosphere, they act like an umbrella to keep the sunlight from even entering and warming the planet to begin with. Industrial activity is simultaneously keeping us cool and warming us up. And the rate of change on the keeping us cool, should those particulates fall out, is somewhere between 5 days and 6 weeks. In contrast, carbon dioxide, the heating associated with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is locked in for at least the next 1,000 years. Two completely different temporal scales for those two different phenomena. So, December 2011, Hansen and colleagues, 1.2 plus or minus 0.2 degrees, and then of course, the refereed journal literature points out that the earlier papers were more conservative than called for. So Levy and colleagues come out in 2013 and indicate that as low as a 35% reduction in industrial activity drives a very rapid spike in global average temperature. And then from February 8th of 2019, just a few months ago, Rosenfeld and colleagues indicate that we have greatly underestimated the aerosol masking effect. This is from the journal Science. You'd be hard-pressed to find a scientist who would argue with a paper published in the journal Science. So, this is the doomed if you do, doomed if you don't proposition. If we maintain industrial activity, it will continue to heat the Earth. Apparently, according to a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, heading us straight for the Pliocene in 2030. And if we turn down industrial activity, we don't even have to turn it all off. If we turn down industrial activity, the planet heats up even faster. These are actual facts from the actual journal literature. So it could be that a financial crisis slows industrial activity sufficiently to cause that increase in global average temperature. It could be. There are 5 other means by which we could lose habitat for humans. I'm not going to go through them because we can talk about that later if you'd like.
Can you just name them?
Sure. There's the 50 gigaton burst of methane proposed by Natalia Shukova and colleagues at the 2008 meetings of the European Geophysical Union, a notion supported by at least 3 journal articles subsequently, 2 by Shukova's research team and 1 by Sarov and colleagues in 2017, indicating that such bursts of methane have occurred in the past and therefore are likely to occur in the future. Shukova and colleagues did not indicate that an ice-free Arctic was required for that to occur. That it was highly likely for abrupt release at any time. That's how they described the methane, which they called the hydrates in that study. That's one. There's also methane released from terrestrial permafrost. So Shukova and colleagues are working on the relatively shallow seafloor of the Arctic Ocean and have concluded that an abrupt methane release is highly possible at any time. That's 10.5 years ago they reached that conclusion. And then there's also methane released from terrestrial permafrost, which, if you're paying attention at all, you're seeing permafrost turn into permamelt in many places around the planet. This paper is from Geosciences, November 23rd, 2018, by Russian researchers working in the region known as Yamal. And the methane release from terrestrial permafrost measured up to a little bit more than 8,500 parts per million. Typically, methane release is measured in parts per billion in the atmosphere. And this is 8,500 parts per million, or about 8.5 million parts per billion. So that's a tremendous release of methane going on as a result of melting permafrost. Number 3 is a decline in grain harvest. Again, as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity generates a 1 degree C global average temperature rise in a short period of time. Could that industrial activity come not from the result of a financial crisis, but instead from the inability to grow, store, and distribute grains at scale? If you've been paying attention to what's going on in the interior of the United States, you know that there's a lot of grain stored out there that is underwater. 80% of this year's grain harvest that typically is in the ground right now, typically it's seeded already, 80% has not been seeded yet because of what's being called a land hurricane. Will they get it planted? I don't know. Item 4 is an ice-free Arctic projected in the annual review of Earth and Planetary Sciences to occur in 2016 plus or minus 3 years. I'd say we've dodged 6 bullets so far. I talked to this lead author of this paper, Wisław Maslowski, when I was in Monterey a few days ago, and he said that he no longer expects such an event, an ice-free Arctic, to occur this year. He said that their projection was not conservative enough, and so he does not expect an ice-free Arctic in this, the 7th year of that 2016 plus or minus 3 years. So that's very good news for anybody who is enjoying habitat for Homo sapiens on Earth. I asked him when he expected such an event to happen, an ice-free Arctic, and his ability to dodge that question, despite the way I asked it many times, was impressive. So I think he's been burned once. He realizes that they made a mistake by relying upon too small of a data set, with its final point being 2007, which was the lowest Arctic ice in history up till that point. So they ended at 2007, which dragged down the projection a little bit and pointed it towards 2016.
Now he says 2016 plus or minus 3 years. Now he says that didn't happen. He's certainly not going to offer an opinion about when it might happen. However, Arctic ice right now is lower than it's ever been at this date since we began measuring with satellites in 1979. And finally,
and this one is an unknown, is the El Nino that probably is currently underway. During the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the ocean, which acts as a battery and stores heat and stores carbon dioxide, gives up some of that heat, gives up some of that carbon dioxide, and so there's an increase in temperature during El Nino Southern Oscillations on land where most of our thermometers are. I don't know, and I doubt if anybody knows, if that will be enough to take us over the highest temperature, take us beyond the point at which we're able to grow grains at scale. And we might be there as a result of the so-called land hurricane already. One of the likely outcomes of an ice-free Arctic, whenever it occurs, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who studies the issue who would say that it will never happen, because the trend since 1979 is down. There's a lot of this. There's a lot of variation in these natural systems. But I don't think anybody who studied the issue would come out and say that will never happen. We will never have an ice-free Arctic. So at some point that's almost certain to happen, and when it does, because of the exacerbation of the feedbacks built in, that's likely to increase the global average temperature of the planet 6 degrees or so Celsius, which is a profoundly rapid rate of change, even if it plays out over a few years. And we don't know, because the last time this happened was 3 million years ago, and there was nobody around keeping track. Approximately 10 times as long ago as Homo sapiens has been on Earth was the last time we had an ice-free Arctic. So, but even if it takes only a few years, that will generate at least a 5.5 degree, probably closer to a 6 or 7 degree Celsius global average temperature rise based on the feedbacks that we currently know about, based on the work of Peter Wadhams, for example, the loss in albedo, the latent heat, the methane release virtually certain to occur at that time, and so forth. Now that 5 or 6 degrees is important because according to a paper published on November 13th of last year by Strona and Bradshaw in Scientific Reports, that's the peer-reviewed journal, it's Scientific Reports, they point out the co-extinctions that, according to that paper, would annihilate all life on the planet. Here's a quote from Strona, the lead author of the paper, the following day in an Australian newspaper. Quote, "Our paper demonstrates that even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear." And so this is what I was talking about earlier. We depend upon a whole bunch of other species for our own survival, to pollinate our crops, to clean the water, to decompose the organic material into soil, and so on. So we depend upon a whole bunch of other species. Their paper includes the word co-extinctions in it, and so they're describing a domino effect that is likely to result from rapid heating of the planet. Now, I never thought I'd see this in a peer-reviewed journal article, but the authors in the article go on to say that even though their conclusion is that a 5 or 6 degree Celsius global average temperature rise is enough to eliminate all life on Earth, they go on to say, we don't really think that could happen. So, cognitive dissonance, anybody? We really don't think this, that's what the results say, but it's pretty terrifying, so we don't think it could happen. So it was a really interesting article to read and see the authors go out and look over the edge and then come back. And that kind of language generally does not appear in the peer-reviewed journal literature because it's too wishy-washy. Your results show this, therefore you describe this. So it's very interesting to see that in print.
Would you call that the action of hope?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they really want something to not happen, so they write about it. Even though the results indicate that it will happen, they write that it might not happen, and it might not. You know, we're talking about numbers that we have never experienced as a species, or we wouldn't be here as a species. The rate of change is just too great for all the species that we depend upon. So it's hard to tell how this plays out.
Excuse me. Who are the peers that are reviewing?
Oh. So the peer review process goes something like this. Peter submits a paper. He submits a paper to the journal Conservation Biology. And I'm the editor of the journal Conservation Biology. And so I take Peter's paper and I find 3 colleagues who I think are very knowledgeable about this topic that Peter was writing about. And so I send it to you and you and you. And I ask you to please provide a review. You don't get paid for this. This is professional courtesy. If you're going to get published in the peer-reviewed journal literature, then you're expected to do your part of the service for the industry by reviewing other people's papers. So 2 of the 3 of you conclude that this paper is worthwhile. It has significant problems. The 3rd reviewer says, no, this is utter crap. And so as the editor, I take this information and I can make a decision. By the way, Peter doesn't know the names of these people. It's blind review. So they can let go. And so I get 2 positive reviews that say there's a bunch more work that needs to be done, and 1 review that says throw it out altogether, it's not worth publishing in our esteemed journal. And so I send it out to another reviewer because I'm on the fence about this one. These 3 people know more than I do. I'm on the fence, so I send it to another reviewer. And that one comes back positive. So I look at the comments, and by the way, now a year has passed since Peter submitted the paper to Conservation Biology. A year has gone by. And my conclusion, based on the reviews of these 4 individuals, is that Peter needs to collect more field data for another year or 2 to solidify the findings. So that's my outcome. I send it back to Peter. I say, here are the reviews with the names blacked out, so you can't say who said these terrible things or good things or whatever they said. And so Peter now has a choice. If he goes and get it published in conservation biology, he has to head back out to the field for another year or 2, collect some more data, see if it supports the findings that he has come up with so far. And then he can resubmit it. Or he can submit it, he can just say, conservation biology is setting too high of a bar. I'm going to send it to a different journal, sends it to a different editor, it goes to a different set of peer reviewers, and the process begins anew. So it really, it's a rigorous process by which ideas are bantied about by experts in the field.
Well, then I wonder why the process that you described where the data showed one thing, his conclusion was the other, how did that make it beyond the peers?
Are you talking about the 5 or 6 degree temperature rise that would eliminate all life on Earth?
You apparently
Yeah.
weren't one of the peers.
No, I was not. Well, I never thought I would see that. Because here's authors arguing that what they found couldn't possibly be true. So it's very strange. That's why I indicated.
These things directly?
What's that?
Can we access these papers directly, or is it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so you just Google peer-reviewed literature on a certain topic and you'll get links?
Sure. You can go to Google Scholar. That's the most immediate route. Instead of using Google, there's a bunch of Google things, and one of them is Google Scholar. And then you can just type in names. For example, you can type in Hansen, James Hansen, and you're going to get dozens of papers.
Aren't most of these linked on your website? Or some of these?
All the information I'm presenting can be found at guymcpherson.com. There's an essay that's linked in the bottom right called Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored, and you can click on that and then click to all of the papers that I'm talking about. Now, sometimes you won't have access without pay to anything beyond the abstract. So the organizations that publish these peer-reviewed journals have to at least break even. Mostly they're nonprofit organizations of one kind or another, but they at least have to break even. So libraries subscribe to them, individuals subscribe to them, and the abstract is available for public consumption, but very frequently the entire paper is not available. You have to pay extra for that. And it's generally a fairly modest amount, especially if you're only interested in 5 or 10 papers. That's going to cost you maybe 50 or $100. Or you can go to the library. You can go to any university library and they're going to have them all. So you can get them for free for the price of getting to your university library.
So it's 8:20 now.
All right. So let me just look at the other 50 minutes I had.
Can I just ask one little question?
Yes, please.
I've started to see just recently a few more things about the air. I read just a couple days ago a Scandinavian scientist speaking about the aerosol, like saying basically catch-22.
Right.
And so, is that and so they were talking about being able to alter, us doing something to alter that situation.
Right.
He was against it, but because then that sort of being the catch-22 defeats everybody's recycling, or not recycling, but if the world does whatever you would do to try to, and then it's going to get warmer. So that's not really talked about in any, no one really, when everybody's talking about we need to do something, they don't
Right.
really talk about that. Is that because, I heard you talk about it, and then I tried to look for other people talking about it, and then I've seen some things cropping up now, like I saw that the other day. Is that because that is still being investigated, or because they're just not going to talk about that, or that's what?
The journal literature is clear, including a paper in Science from January of this year.
Yeah.
The unwillingness of the corporate media and the governments and paid climate scientists to talk about it is muddled, apparently. Because you're right, I can't find anybody else who will talk about it. I interviewed Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, on my radio show, and their big push is to reduce emissions, which is what we hear about every day. Those of us interested in climate change have heard for a long time that we need to reduce emissions. And the people saying that fail to point out that emissions are tied to the aerosol masking effect. And so I repeatedly asked Roger Hallam about the aerosol masking effect when I interviewed him on my radio show, and he has subsequently delivered several presentations and done several interviews in which he refuses to talk about the aerosol masking effect, the catch-22.
So it's just,
I don't know why they aren't talking about it.
okay. It's just I guess yeah, like I thought maybe they were gonna start because I saw this. I was kind of surprised. Other than you, and you know, I saw somebody. It was sort of a mainstream thing. I can't remember what it was, and he was talking about it. So I thought I didn't know if we would start hearing about that, or that was just too. I mean, maybe that's just.
It's been severely downplayed, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You know, we've known about it for a while, and yet it isn't popping up on anybody's radar. Why not? Why won't anybody talk about it? Why are the media and the governments telling you to reduce emissions and not telling you that at the same time you're reducing emissions, you have to also increase aerosols? We got to have both. We got to maintain those aerosols in the atmosphere, or the rate of change will be so great that many, many species will go extinct, and it's hard for me to imagine we will squeeze through that bottleneck. But I don't know why people don't talk about it, unless they just want you to remain on the treadmill you're on, which is the most convenient thing for the masses, right? Here and then there.
It seems that, and it has seemed this way to me for quite some time, everyone that's trying to do something is like going down the wrong road, right? I mean, the Green New Deal.
Okay, so let's talk about doing something, because I'm frequently accused of doing nothing and to encourage other people to do nothing. No, I know. I just want to rant for a little bit here, if you don't mind. So I left the monetary system 10 years ago. I've been living off-grid for 10 years, literally shitting in a bucket. I made sacrifices that I don't know anybody else on the planet has made. 10 years with no paycheck? Anybody? Retired at the age of 49, still continuing to present the information at my own cost. Enormous sacrifice I've made. And I'm the least interviewed person on the planet. I've been interviewed by the leading media outlets in Canada, New Zealand, Iran, and Russia. And I've been libeled or slandered by the Washington Post and the New York Times, the leading mouthpieces of empire in the United States, because of my crazy ideas about near-term human extinction. You can draw your own conclusions about that. Yeah.
Would any technological advance that you can think of balance the dilemma about how much darkness we need in the atmosphere relative to less pollution?
Right, so the question is there any technological advancement that we could come up with that would keep the aerosols in the sky or some other means of reflecting incoming sunlight, while also starting to draw down or eliminate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? No. Some people have proposed a process called marine cloud brightening, and Peter Wadhams, who is the world authority on Arctic ice. The man has conducted more than 50 expeditions above and below the Arctic ice. He's the go-to guy for Arctic ice. And he has said that we need to use marine cloud brightening by putting a bunch of engines out in the sea over the Arctic and pumping up seawater up into the sky to create a bright layer of marine clouds that will reflect incoming sunlight. This idea has been proposed for years, And I don't see any governments taking it seriously. Bear in mind that civilization is a heat engine. So that's a means of keeping the heat engine going. So that's the closest thing I've seen to a technological advance, but I don't see anybody taking it particularly seriously. And that's because I think, if I had to guess, I'd say that the analysts who work for the surveillance security state in the United States and other countries know what I know, because my work is freely available. So they know about the catch-22. But I don't really know because, you know, I don't spend a lot of time at the Pentagon hanging out with those folks and having conversations. Here and then there.
I'm feeling better about driving my 50-year-old diesel bus and my 40-year-old diesel car. Though they do run on vegetable oil and probably don't emit as much particulate matter as they should. I can change that. So I change it at the pump, right? More particulates. Couple things. First, I wondered if you'd comment about the difference between the Aeolia event and the Permian extinction and how that tripped the other way for the oceans to suck all the carbon out of the atmosphere and freeze the planet 600 million years ago. And then, as far as your scenarios are concerned, I do think I agree that people aren't going to stop burning things anytime soon. Probably if society starts to collapse, we'll burn everything. Burn old buildings, and that's what people like to do. They like to burn everything up and fight with each other and stuff. So that's
one of the first things I really got in trouble for as a kid was burning down the shed.
Right, it's fun, and we've been having fun for a few million years that way. And people did exist in the Pleistocene and you know, or proto-humanoids for the last 7 million years. So I've heard you say on your YouTube lectures that there's a narrow pathway through geoengineering, which you don't believe will work, but there are many carbon sequestration methods that have been proposed, including your colleague's space umbrella thing. I don't, and if we could draw down the carbon and you know, maintain the aerosols, as you just said, then there's a pathway there, and also human beings eat anything, you know, we eat bugs and bacteria, you know. Probably not great for us to eat wheat, corn, and rice anyway. So why not? So here's the question: why not try? Why not try? Why not trying to get control? Our governments have never paid attention to us, so that's nothing new.
I'm not suggesting you not try.
Okay, but try to fix it. Try to do something, you know, and also realize that it's you know, ultimately sort of almost futile. So.
I hear from people every day that I need to do something with respect to letting the government know.
No.
I have no platform.
Take control of
I have no money.
That's the way, I mean, it has to, no, all of us. It's
Okay.
you. Right.
So,
It doesn't want to hear.
So what?
right, the government doesn't want to hear. In fact, much as I dislike Trump,
It's not telling them, it's demanding.
he's right about burning diesel and burning coal. Right? That's helping to keep us cool. I'm no fan of burning coal, mind you. So what shall we do? I think there's any number of things we can do. We can try. I'm not in a position to make that happen.
But I think what I understand is that basically if they don't acknowledge, from what I've tried to gather from the information, is that sort of the aerosol problem is sort of like the situation where we can't just say, oh, well, if we do all these things, you know, if the countries come together and we do all these things, that isn't the answer. So now we know after, I don't know if it was 9/11 or whatever, you know, now we know that that's not the answer. And it doesn't seem that anybody else knows that's not the answer, or a few people know that's not the answer. So therefore, I mean, if we never had anybody doing anything anyway when we thought it was, you know, reducing everything, and now we know that it's not reducing everything, that's not the answer, and there's this other combination that needs to happen, that seems very difficult, and that doesn't seem very possible when we don't even have anybody but you and maybe a couple other guys. So that's where it seems, not to say hopeless, but that's the reality of our situation. Is that sort of correct? Like there isn't really anybody who's any other scientist or group or organization that's other than, you know, theorizing if we
Right. There's the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, which is comprised of a handful of people who have this thing that Sam Carana calls his climate plan. And the climate plan has been around for at least 5 years, and no government has taken it seriously, and no corporation has taken it seriously. So the Notre Dame burns, and immediately there's $1 billion available to rebuild the Notre Dame. $1 billion would cure poverty throughout the whole world. $1 billion, if spent in the right way, would fix poverty. But apparently, people with $1 billion are not interested in that. If there were a way forward, I've no doubt that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and a handful of other bajillionaires would come forward and say, if this is all it takes is a few $1 billion to fix the climate crisis, we got this. Why would they not?
Right, that seems
They don't want to die.
the issue that I've sort of gathered is that if there isn't anyone knowing about it or, you know, or interested in it, then it's kind of hard to get anyone doing anything about it because it's not the problem, I guess, that we perceived recently. We are understanding there's a different problem, so if nobody's understanding that, then.
Right. I don't think there's anything to be done except for continue to look for solutions at the societal level and at the individual level to try to act like decent human beings. And that's where I think this ultimately goes, is that I don't know your expiration date, but it's hard for me to imagine a human being will be alive in 2030, and probably before then because of the abrupt rise in temperature associated with the heat engine, or the even faster rise in temperature associated with slowing the heat engine. So what that means is our time here is short. How are you going to act?
I'm sorry, I know you produced a bunch of stuff, but originally I asked you about the Aeolia event.
Yes.
So how is it that the Earth tipped into ice house instead of hot house there?
It's done, we don't know. We don't know. We've had lots of ice ages.
Right. That was bigger die-off than
Yeah.
the Permian extinction.
Right, and we've had die-offs ice ages as recently as, well, the maximum ice extinction was about 18,000 years ago. You'd think we'd know more about those negative feedbacks that have to kick in to lead to an ice age, but we don't, as nearly as I can tell. You know, and I've been trying to study those because I've been looking for that silver bullet that will give us the way out of this. It's one of those things that we just don't know a lot about. Even though they happen relatively frequently, ice ages are, you know, a dime a dozen. Not exactly. For the most part, over the last 2 billion years, we've been at hothouse Earth. But we have dipped into these ice ages for reasons that I don't understand, and I don't think anybody else does either. At least they're not coming forward with an explanation that makes sense to me. Oh, yeah, right there, and then you.
The one piece of information that I wanted to get the author on was the one around the 5 degrees and extinction of most species. You said all species, but I can't.
No, they said all species.
They said all species. Who is that author?
Strona and Bradshaw were the authors of that paper. It was published in Scientific Reports, I think, but let me just check that. Yes, Scientific Reports, Strona and Bradshaw, November 13th of last year.
Just if you look at the spectrum of temperatures on Earth and where species could migrate, that one's hard for me to grok, but
Yeah. Well, it's about the rate of change. They're biologists, and one of them is a conservation biologist, so they know about the rate of change. So they're projecting into the not too distant future that sort of temperature rise. And that's supported by the abundant evidence now on the Arctic ice and when it goes away and how rapid the heating of the whole planet will be.
Yeah, I've been tracking this since I was a kid. I grew up in the middle of Alaska. My mom was just in Antarctica. My dad builds villages in Alaska for places where villages are falling into the ocean. My stepdad has access to an icebreaker next year to study ecosystems in the ocean there. So like, this is in my blood and in my bones, and the biggest issue to me is, when I walked into the room, I was a little bit late because I thought it was in the other room, but is the grieving piece and the human dimension piece. And I believe that we're all putting a lot of blinders on, or we get angry or we leave the room, but it's like that was all representative of the larger conversation, you know, that's happening in the world. It's like, I'm late to the table, I'm in the wrong room, I'm in the wrong chat group. You know, he gets upset because he wants to just be listening to you, where this may be a valid voice. And that's the human dimension that I feel like isn't going to be catalyzed until there's major crises, and the crisis is actually knocking at your front door, and then you start to pay attention. And maybe it's too late, and maybe it's not. But it's that human dimension that is most interesting to me.
Right, the human dimension is absolutely key here, and I've been hearing my whole life that if we just start right now and come together, we can solve X problem or Y problem. And I haven't seen us come together, much less right now. We recycle a little. That's it. That's how we came together. That was so a few people could make a lot of money. That's why we have those recycling programs. Yeah, right. Now the market for recycling is gone. You're absolutely right.
Like, we don't know. Like, nobody really has good information. I mean, you're looking at different peer-reviewed articles and all these different things. Like, I feel personally really paralyzed. I've got 2 kids. Like, I can buy my daughter a metal straw instead of plastic straws. And then, like, the tide of her life is already so predictated by society and what she was born into. You know, my overall experience is being paralyzed and not knowing how to act or what to do, other than, you know, like what you said, kindness, and deal with my own grieving process so that I'm able to function.
I don't think that's all that you can do, or all that any of us can do. Edward Abbey pointed out in his writing many times, Edward Abbey, the desert anarchist, who lived in Tucson, Arizona most of his adult life, and he practiced anarchism.
And he was a reasonably well-known writer in his day. And he wrote, "Action is the antidote to despair." So if you despair, if you feel paralyzed, then maybe you should do something.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that something is, because we have this catch-22. So I tried doing things. I moved off grid and had 3.15 kilowatt solar array and composting toilets and a
root cellar filled with 6 tons of food, and I learned how to grow all of my food. I became a master cheesemaker. I'm a lifelong academic. I could barely distinguish between a screwdriver and a zucchini when I started that project. And within 2 years, I was able to grow enough food for 5 people, with the exception of grains, year-round, to grow and preserve that food. So there are things we can do. As it turns out, if everybody had done that at the time when I did it 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation today because of global dimming. So I don't know what to do besides treat each other decently, treat each other with compassion, with respect. I think we need to go through the grieving process, and then we need to go through the grief recovery process as individuals and as families. You know, I've heard variations on this quote, most recently from Charles Bukowski, but you look back through time and there's some minor deviations to the lines, and it goes something like this: find what you love and let it kill you. That's what I'm doing. This is killing me. Delivering these presentations is costing me every dime. It's destroying my heart. This is no fun to stand up here in front of people and remind them that their time is short. In response, I receive betrayal abundantly. I've lost essentially every relationship I had from 10 years ago. The betrayal has been enormous. The other response is defamation. Attempted character assassination. I'm not enjoying this. I hate this. This is probably my last speaking tour. This is probably one of the last 5 times I will speak in public, because it does me no good. And it just irritates the shit out of people like you. Mostly it's Peter's fault. Isabel?
I just wanted to say, this is from the Business Insider on August 7, 2018, Jeremy Berkey. This is one of the largest banks issued an alarming warning that Earth is running out of resources to sustain life. And it goes on. So if one of the largest banks already recognizes this, I mean,
Well, yeah,
they understand.
Just in the last few years, if you stop and notice, it went from, oh, well, there's a problem way off in the future, to now the IPCC in their report in 2016 still was way out in the future. And then all of a sudden they come out with a new report early, 2 years early, in case you didn't realize that, saying, whoops, you got 12 years. 12 years, IPCC, everyone has to agree. All the government, if I understand this correctly, they all have to agree. The whole
Yeah,
world
every
has to-
working group has to reach consensus. That's 20 plus or minus 10 people in a working group of scientists. They all have to agree on anything they're going to report. They have to reach consensus. Well, I doubt if you could get 20 people in this room to agree what to have on their pizza. So we have to agree on everything that comes out of the working group in the report, and then it goes to the governments and they censor the crap out of it.
And even after all that censoring, they said you got 12 years to turn this thing around.
And by the way, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said a month before that report came out, in September of 2018, he said we have until 2020 to stop this thing. We can't do anything between now and 2020, which is a few months away, that will reduce the heating of the planet. We can do some things that will accelerate the heating of the planet, like destroying civilization, getting those aerosols falling out of the sky. That's the only thing we can do, and it goes the wrong way.
Right, everything's been coming in, right? Because now the banks are saying it, the government, the Pentagon's been saying it for years. Major problem, more and more people coming out. Now it's in all these other magazines, and now all these other writers and authors are saying sooner, 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 faster than expected, faster than expected. It's all creeping toward what the doctor has said for 10 years now that he's been daring to say this, is it's happening a lot faster than we think. Minutes.
What about how all of this, land restoration and mass planting of trees and reversing desertification all over the world, how does that impact these two of things?
I wish. But we're going the wrong direction on every single one of those. The Fertile Crescent was the Fertile Crescent a few thousand years ago. Here's what civilizations do. Forests greet us and deserts dog our heels. We destroy. Through civilization, we destroy. It's industrial civilization that's responsible for the sixth mass extinction. It's industrial civilization that's responsible for the fouling of the air and the dirtying of the water and the washing of the soils into the sea. It's industrial civilization that is responsible for all this, and we just showed up. We were born at the right time or the wrong time or whatever you want to call it in human history. We got here at the most wealthy time, most information-rich time in history, and we're so constrained by this set of living arrangements. We can barely speak out without people yelling at us. That doesn't fit. So,
None of that's fast enough. None of those things can be anywhere close to the rate
People-
we're heating the oceans. And
people tell me all the time we need to plant 1 million trees. Okay, really? We've lost 1 trillion trees since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. 1 trillion. You think we're going to plant 1 trillion trees in the next few years? No,
that
we
would
aren't.
fix it if we did.
And it wouldn't fix it if we did. We've triggered too many self-reinforcing feedback loops, 6 dozen that I know about.
One last burning question. Really burning.
Yes.
Okay, so my question.
Well, he had a question before. I'd like, he's in the study group. If you would give it up to somebody, maybe this gentleman here we haven't heard from.
What's your feeling about chemtrails?
Oh, perfect. I'm so glad we changed that
I know what it is, you want to run away.
I'm here to talk about abrupt climate change and our response to that phenomenon. So I would,
Do you think they're real?
I would,
Quick dimming on the planet?
I would gladly talk with you about that at the break, but I don't want to take us away from the notion of abrupt climate change, loss of habitat for our species, and how we respond as individuals with a completely different topic. So I will gladly talk to you about it. I just don't want to distract us from what I think is the important reason that we're all here.
Thank you.
Can I ask the one burning question, the last question?
Yes.
Is there anything we can do
Of course.
to turn this around to survive?
No. There's everything you can do in your individual lives. There is everything you can do. You can live fully. You can live with intention. You can live with urgency. You can live with death in mind. You can live to the limits of this very restrictive culture and then go beyond that. You don't have to do what the culture tells you to do. You can talk about sex and bodily functions. What you do with this information is up to you, but what I've done is to be bolder than I've ever been before. I have lived beyond the limits of this very restrictive culture. I have lived with adventure in ways that I never imagined this old man would be capable of living. Life is short. Play hard.
Round of applause.